Welcome back. Our next guest is a trailblazing advocate whose impact on racial justice and digital organizing is felt across the globe. From her groundbreaking work in the White House during former President Obama's term to her role in founding Freedom March NYC, which is one of the largest youth led civil rights organizations, she has been at the forefront of transformative movements. Here now is social impact strategist Chelsea Miller. Chelsea, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I want to learn a little bit more about you. So, can you tell us, how do you believe your generation's approach to activism differs from previous generations? And, how do you fit into that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I always say that we come from a long tradition of young people at the forefront of movements. So I think the question has always been what are the tools that throughout time young folks have utilized in order to create change? And also, how do we understand social change within the lens of a multi generational approach? And so, specifically, when we're talking about Gen Z, when we're talking about the ways in which technology is essentially a tool that we use to mobilize today, we've seen the way that social media has played such a critical role in that. We see the way that our definition of community has expanded even beyond locally to national conversations, to global conversations, and really making sure that we are holding ourselves to account, but also institutions, right? Governments, leaders, to how we want to see the world and the work that's required to do that.
Now, you've been a powerful voice in racial justice and digital organizing. What inspired you to focus on these areas, and how has your experience shaped your approach?
I always say that I did not necessarily choose this work. I feel like this work, in a lot of ways, chose me because of my experience as being first generation American and being raised by a mom whose background is in social work. And so, for me, at a very young age, I was exposed to a lot just navigating New York and being from an immigrant family and seeing so many of the disparities. And so, I have always felt a responsibility to not be the exception to what it looks like to be, a young Black girl navigating this city that I'm from, but also this country. And so by default, I think that this work has really called me. But I would say on the digital organizing side, that really was birthed through 2020 with the development of Freedom March NYC and the realization that because so many people were, of course, quarantined at home, the responsibility of digital organizing as a tool of disseminating information and being able to create change in real time and in real life. And so that was really important for folks who oftentimes and historically resources have been stripped and feeling as though there aren't many platforms or ways to be able to amplify your voice or creating change, despite the pros and cons, right, of technology and social media. I think one of the things that we can absolutely acknowledge is that it is one of the ways that we are able to connect and provide information within community. And we did that a lot throughout 2020 and beyond, and signaling, right, that this is one of the key tools, at least within our generation, of being able to mobilize and organize. And so digital organizing is at the heart of so much of the work that I do because at the heart of it, it really is about information and storytelling.
Now, I also want to add that Gen Z is a wide range of, people at different points in their lives. But, with that being said, what are the most effective ways for Gen Z activists to engage and mobilize their peers around social justice issues? And that could be, people who are in their 20s, but also people who are in high school or still in school in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it really, well, it's funny when you ask this question because for me, I always say that everyone has their strengths and contributions and skills to contribute to this movement. But when we are talking about some of the easier tools to think about, social media definitely being one of them, because at this point, most Gen Z folks have phones, right? I also think about the importance of not simply relying solely on social media and digital media as a toolkit, but also keeping in mind the power of community. I always say that digital media should not substitute organizing work happening on the ground. And so, the best way, especially when I think about how I even started out in organizing organizing is through my community and doing work there. And so it's so important that your community members know you. It's so important that you spend time understanding the stakeholders in your local community, because as much as we want to tackle a lot of the national and global issues, a lot of the times these conversations start at home. These conversations start with the folks who are your neighbors, and using that as an example and a testament to the work that we can do on a larger scale.
Now, can you tell me a little bit more about the youth led organization, Freedom March NYC, which you founded? Can you tell us how that started? And what does it mean to be youth led?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Freedom March NYC, we were birthed during the George Floyd protests of 2020 and organized some of the largest protests to take place in New York, but also the country. We spoke at the March on Washington. We have launched media campaigns to galvanize young people around civics and voting and understanding our history. We have worked on policy issues. We have worked with elected leaders on creating change and thinking about what that looks like within the context of civics and protest and demonstration and the ability for young people to exercise their First Amendment rights. And so a lot of our work has spanned between being on the ground and showing up in the movement to also that media piece and the storytelling piece. And so when I think about the work of Freedom March NYC, it really is grounded in community, is grounded in this idea of how do we show up sustainably to do work. And when we talk about the fact that we are youth led, we are a team that is led by young people. And so in that we show up unapologetically, and we really do make sure that at the center of our work that young voices are amplified and that resources are provided to be able to support young people, whether that be through trainings, teachings. We've launched freedom summer campaigns focused on educating young people on how they can organize in their communities. We have done so much work that has centered young people at the heart of what we do, because we really do believe that when we talk about systems change, when we talk about generational change, young people have historically been at the center of that.
I definitely want to add that as well because that is something that I've noticed. Even when we talk about civil rights movement in America, we've seen there were young people, teenagers who were like, "Hey, I'm not getting off the bus," or I'm going to take my seat and kind of know my rights and what I have as a human. So I definitely want to point out that young people have always been very active when it comes to social justice and understanding what they deserve as people. With that being said, as we evolve, what are some ways that older adults and just adults in general can better support youth who want to be more involved in social justice?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things that you said, and I'm happy that you mentioned it and spoke about the civil rights movement, because this year actually marks the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer of 1964. And so we know that, again, there is that tradition of youth organizing that has continued to be a part of the story. And so something for us to be mindful of is, of course, how do we continue to preserve those stories and that legacy of change? And then when we are talking about what does it look like for folks overall to really create space and create room for young people and stand in solidarity. I always say that this movement is multi generational. When we talk about the resources that's needed, when we talk about the amplification that's needed, when we talk about the systems change that is required. And so I think it really is about understanding how do we leverage all of the tools that are at right our disposal to be able to do the work that is required across racial justice, across climate change, across equity, across the ways that we are thinking about the future of our world and social change. And so I think all of these conversations are connected. And I always say that one voice being at a table does not remove the importance of another. And so when we are at tables and when we are in conversation, how are we making sure that everyone is represented there in that moment? And how do we make sure that we are creating and crafting the world that we are envisioning?
Now, I definitely want to add that we've been using social media as a society to kind of aid in our social justice for maybe 10 to 15 years, maybe somewhere in between that. We saw this with Mike Brown many years ago, and it's something that we're continuing to see as we move on. But, we kind of see we kind of do repeated the same things over and over again. So with that being said, I'm curious to know what are some key strategies you believe are essential for creating long-lasting and sustainable change in social movements? Because it starts online, but as you mentioned before, we want to do some, work, offline on the ground. So what are some key strategies we need to create long-lasting change?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, and it's so important to dispel, I think this myth that young people are not organizing because we are, and communities are not organizing because we are. I think that social media and the digital space is a tool, it is not the tool. And so when I think about what is required and the tools to be able to continue to show up in real time, I think that we've come from, again, a historical tradition of organizing in real time with the resources that we have. And so when we talk about even the civil rights movement of the 60s and the way that they were sending letters back home, the way that they were communicating through social networks and channels and using churches and different institutions as a way to build community. In that same way, we still have a legacy of institutions and community members and leaders and networks that are at our disposal. I think that it's really important for us to just be mindful of the fact that sometimes social media conflates the idea of impact with numbers, and remembering that even when we're talking about the civil rights movement of the 1960s and Freedom Summer, it was a couple of thousand young people who went down to Mississippi to organize, and even the organizers in Mississippi as well who participated. And so when we are talking about numbers, I think sometimes we feel like we aren't doing enough because maybe only a few hundred people have participated in action or have participated in a post or have seen something that you have posted online. But remember that historically, sometimes it doesn't take millions of people to create that change. Sometimes it's just a few dozen who are sitting at the counters and saying that we are desegregating. Sometimes it's a few hundred, right, that are organizing and taking over a bridge. Sometimes it's a few thousand that are going down to mobilize. And so don't feel that you need to be viral, that you need to have an account with millions and millions of followers, that you need to have a community of millions of people in order to create change, because sometimes it is those very small stories that create that ripple effect, that create waves that continue for generations and generations to see.
Now, what were some of the challenges you've possibly faced in sustaining your activism, and how have you overcome them?
I would say one of the biggest challenges of sustaining your work is the mental toll that it takes on you, especially, being at the center of so many of these conversations. We are, of course, in the middle of a very polarizing and historical election cycle. And so this is really important for our work, especially in being at the center of both media and social change and civics. I'm feeling it on so many different fronts right now. And so I think that for me, it has been really important to just make sure that you are taking care of yourself and really being intentional about what that looks like. Who are the people that you need around you? What is this team that you need around you? What is the support system and the mechanisms of being able to take a step back and take care of yourself that you need? And then also being okay with the fact that all of the answers will not be figured out. And I really urge so many young people who are stepping into this space and are caring so much to be mindful that it is okay to feel like you are still in a season of asking so many questions and figuring out what your work looks like, and reminding yourself that it is okay to evolve in this work. And I think that for me, one of the biggest things as well is being mindful of how do we create that multi generational and multiracial approach to how we think about change, because we cannot carry movements and we cannot carry the world alone. And so it's so important for us to just be mindful of the fact that the movement will exist with or without us. It's a question of how we show up to contribute to it.
Now, a lot of your work revolves around racial justice, women's leadership, reproductive justice, and climate change. I want to talk about the importance of intersectionality and how do you address this intersectionality in a lot of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we know for a fact that climate change disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities. We know for a fact that there is going to be so many changes that are going to be happening within the next few years and across decades that are going to be impacting our communities, from economically the impact of climate change to what that looks like when we talk about creating communities that are sustainable, everything from addressing food deserts to being able to address job access within climate equity. And so there is so many conversations that we know we cannot talk about one without talking about the other. And so, a lot of times, what we have found though is that these conversations end up being segmented as a way to keep Black folks and brown folks and young people and all folks who oftentimes exist at the margins outside of these rooms where these critical conversations are being had. And so we do a lot of work around showing that all of these conversations are connected, and you cannot simply put us in a box when it comes to addressing the issues that are taking place in our communities, but rather you must put us at the forefront and you must put us at the center of how we understand these issues coming together.
Now, with that being said, how do you envision the role of digital organizing evolving in the next decade? And what role do you hope to play in that evolution?
Yeah, I would say that my vision of digital organizing is for us to be able to transfer so much of the energy that we see online in real time. And so I see that that can happen in so many different ways. That can happen in us taking ownership of how we are building our social networks and making sure that we are also creating a lot more spaces in real time. I also think the importance of more third spaces existing as a way to bring communities together is going to be really important. And I would also say continuing to make sure that we are leaving a digital footprint that is reflective of our values, that is reflective of the world that we are trying to create. Because in a lot of ways, whatever we have online, whatever we create in the digital media space is an archive. And so it is really important for us to be mindful of what that legacy looks like in the next 100 years, in the next 200 years. And so that is really important to the work. And so that is why we spend so much time really making sure that we are centering stories and narratives that are contributing to really getting us to that next phase that we are looking to go into.
Well, Chelsea, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this really important conversation. And I think it's amazing to see, how you're kind of leading the charge of young people making a difference in the world that we live in. So thank you so much.
Oh, of course. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We have to take a quick break. We'll be back after this.